Did the Western obsession with hell come from, and what has happened to it in our century? All is revealed in A Brief History of Hell.
Hell is a straight, dark, and foul-smelling prison, an abode of demons and lost souls, filled with fire and smoke. The straightness of this prison house is expressly designed by God to punish those who refuse to be bound by his laws. By the reason of the great number of the damned, prisoners are heaped together in their awful prison, the walls of which are said to be 4,000 miles thick. The damned are so utterly bound and helpless that, as a blessed Saint Anselm writes, they are not even able to remove from their eye a worm that gnaws it. They lie in exterior darkness, for remember, the fire of hell gives forth no light. It is a never-ending storm of darkness, dark flames and dark fire of burning brimstone, amidst which the bodies are heaped one upon another without a glimpse of air.
In the Old Testament, the main belief before Christianity came along is not of a hell of punishment. It's of a very dreary place somewhere down underground, and the dead all go there and they live like shadows and nothing much happens. And it's very gloomy, but I mean no horrible tortures. And the same idea you get in ancient Greece, of Hades in ancient Greece, which is a similar place. So the dead are like shadows or like autumn leaves sort of blown about.
There is a road that slopes downhill, gloomy with yew trees. It runs through silent places to the underworld. There the sluggish river Styx breathes forth its mists, and by that path descend the ghosts of those newly dead, the shades of mortals laid to rest in their tombs.
When you are dead, you will be in the grave, forgotten forever. Dimly your shadow will flit with the rest, unnoticed, obscure.
The Greeks, on the whole, don't seem to have had any very consistent view about punishment after death. As early as Plato, you have ideas of judges sitting in session in the underworld, assigning places to people, and you have the mythological notion of Tartarus as a place of torture for particularly special criminals, but nothing general, no systematic approach to it. And in some quarters of the Greek world, of course, this is all rather confused and complicated by the notion of reincarnation. So you probably do have to say that it's Christianity that sharpens up the language of punishment after death.
And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away. And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death.
On the whole, the hell industry, as you might call it, developed outside the accepted New Testament. It developed in things like the Apocalypse of Peter, which is quite early on, 2nd century, where St. Peter is taken by an angel to see hell. And it is an appalling place of the most frightful torture, where the punishment suits the crime.
Women who had committed adultery were hung up over boiling excrement. Girls who had not kept their virginity until marriage were whipped until their flesh was torn open. Proud, rich men were rolled back and forth over very sharp stones heated in the fire. Murderers were shut into a narrow place and eaten by evil, creeping things. Those who told lies had their tongues torn out, over and over again.
The obsession with hell is already obvious in early medieval thinking and feeling. I think one of the malicious interpretations would be something like this: that there was so much misery, injustice on earth, famine, oppression, torture, the hopelessness of the condition of most ordinary men and women, something we scarcely remember in our relatively more humane period, that the church brilliantly and politically kept saying, hang on, it'll be made all right afterwards. There will be compensation, the great doctrine of compensation. Those of you who behave, who have suffered unjustly, don't complain here, don't rebel above all. It will be made good. You will be rewarded in a heaven of celestial forgiveness. Those who have oppressed you, who have flogged and tortured and starved and mocked you, they will sizzle forever in hell. It's an immense weapon of delayed social justice.
It's a very, very effective conversion technique. If you actually persuade people that this place exists, then you can get them to do anything. You'll get them to rape and murder their grandmothers. You will certainly get them to bow down and surrender to this Christ. But it's not the Christ, I think, of the gospel. It's a kind of Moloch Christ, a kind of Christ of the God of hell.
I think we have to be very critical of the ways in which the preaching about hell was placed so much in the forefront. Because it seems to me that much of it was based upon a desire to manipulate and to terrorize people. A lot of the time it was to induce in people a servile fear, which I think is very different from the loving confidence that the children of God are supposed to have in relationship to their Father.
And then imagine the sickening stench multiplied a millionfold and a millionfold again by the million upon millions of fetid carcasses massed together in the reeking darkness.
You have the smash, grab, kind of crush the testicles Christology of the Middle Ages, which runs right the way through, and there are elements of it in cruel versions of Christianity today. It does actually make you bloody angry, because the whole thing was a massive inversion of basic Christian insight into the nature of God, which was the inversion of the previous cruel God, the God of power and might, as the English liturgy says, the God of the armies of Israel. Christ came and preached the crucified God, the God who absorbs all the hate, all the bloodlust, and takes it and bears it in his own body on the tree. And yet that becomes the kind of banner you carry into battle as you slaughter. And the thing becomes institutionalized in the Inquisition. If you study the instrumentation of torture, the rack, the various ways they had of stretching people, of crushing people, the hot oil tortures, all in the name of this crucified Christ, all in order to get confessions of witchcraft, confessions of subtle shades of heresy.
where you have a religion relying heavily on terror, on punitive imaginings of eternal guilt, the Inquisitor could say, as they did, and not, I think, hypocritically, that they, if anything, were like doctors, whose treatment in the pain it brought was meant to cure, to cauterize. It was a therapy through horror.
Our earthly fire destroys at the same time as it burns, so that the more intense it is, the shorter its duration. But the fire of hell has this property, that it preserves that which it burns. And though it rages with incredible intensity, it rages forever.
One of the features that's quite striking in the history of thinking about hell is the way in which even some of the great minds of Christianity, like Augustine and Aquinas, have been quite happy with the notion that people in heaven know what's going on in hell and approve of it, and they think it's marvelous. And Aquinas says that it's part of the joy of heaven to rejoice in the justice of God, and if you rejoice in the justice of God, well, then you rejoice in the existence of hell. And alongside that, I think you'd have to put something like a remark made by a Russian monk earlier in this century, who said that it would be impossible to go to heaven so long as you knew there was anybody in hell.
When you look at the great paintings inspired by the Black Death, and then much later, the reflection of these paintings in the hells of Bosch and of others, what strikes you is that it's not as, for example, in Goya, just a horrible death through war or torture. It is a sending of a whole civilization down to the pit of Satan. It were as if Christ's promise, and the Virgin's promise above all, of intercession had failed, and as if hell, which had been contained, God knows with what efforts, underground, had now erupted volcanically and were beginning to eat up life in the cities and the houses. It showed that hell was millimeters away from daily life. It's as if the pavement in the street were very fragile and could suddenly open up. We have marvelous pictures, etchings and woodcuts of human beings in elaborate costumes on their way to a dinner, to a wedding. Suddenly dropping down a kind of hourglass chute into the sand-whirling horror of eternal destruction. And that kind of nightmare will leave profound traces, penitential traces, masochistic traces, but above all, I think, a kind of instability of hope. Hope itself gets a little more fragile.
And so you will find from time to time people dreaming, having visions of punishment. Perhaps the most dramatic is St. Teresa in the 16th century, talking about her own vision of her place in hell, which she describes as being a kind of cupboard. She goes down a long, narrow passage and then is locked up in a cupboard in the wall. And I think that says a great deal about some of her own troubles about her woman's body, and how that to her was an occasion of suffering and humiliation.
One day as I was praying, it seemed suddenly and mysteriously as though I had been plunged into hell. I seemed to be in a long, narrow passage, very low, hot, dark, and oppressive. The ground was awash with filthy, evil-smelling mud, and there were many vicious reptiles round about. At the end of the passage there was a hollow place in the wall, like a cupboard. And it was here that I was confined. I felt a fire within my breast which I cannot describe. It was as if my soul was tearing itself to pieces. There was no hope or comfort in that dreadful place. It was impossible to sit or to lie down. And then the terrible walls began to close in and to suffocate me. I was in the blackest darkness, and yet I could see all that was happening. All this took place 6 years ago, and yet as I speak of it, I begin to go cold with terror.
It is one of the sinister things, too, about the tradition of hell, that the imagery has very much been preoccupied with the hurt that has to be inflicted on the body, because the body is very often seen as the source of evil. And this seems to me to be one of the darker chapters again of Christian cultural history, that everything to do with bodiliness, sexuality, physicality, pleasure is seen as suspect. Now that I find quite staggering as the development from a faith which starts off, or has pretty near its origins, a doctrine of incarnation and the taking on and the hallowing of flesh. But it seems to me to be the only kind of thing which can really explain the sort of wallowing in hatred of the body that's there in a great deal of the doctrine.
One of the things that you pick up from the development of Christianity in the post-Reformation period is the development of what you might call a theatre of hell in terms of preaching of a certain kind. And that's both Catholic and Protestant, though we often associate it with particular kinds of Protestantism these days. It has to do with creating a kind of shared sense of dread and apprehension, which is also enjoyable, as theatre is enjoyable, even when it's showing us terrible things.
Those who are cast into the lake of fire and brimstone shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. The penalty is eternal. The lost soul asks, how many years of ages must it spend in this terrible prison? It is there forever. How long in the company of Satan? Forever. How long burn in the flame of God's indignation? Forever. But will God never turn and pity? Never. Will there be no break in these unendurable pains? None whatever.
In the 19th century, when you get this revival of Christianity after the cool rationalism of the 18th century, which didn't have a great deal of time for hell, but in the 19th century, hell came back into its kingdom again, sometimes in very nasty ways. And there was a most awful Jesuit, appropriately named Furness, who wrote terrible pamphlets for children, for Sunday schools and so on, in which he described the horrors of hell that would be visited on naughty children in the most frightful way.
The little child is in the red-hot oven. Hear how it screams to come out. See how it turns and twists itself about in the fire. It beats its head against the roof of the oven. It stamps its little feet upon the floor. God was very good to this little child. Very likely God saw it would get worse and worse and never repent, and so it would have been punished more severely. So God in his mercy called it out of the world in early childhood.
In our own century, there has been a kind of double development. We have created hells on earth on a bigger scale and perhaps of a more horrible kind than any previous century has done. But at the same time, there has been a very general retreat from the idea of hell. Most people now either don't believe in Christianity at all, and therefore don't believe in the Christian hell, or do believe in Christianity, but no longer believe in a hell of eternal torture and punishment.
We have lost more than the doctrine of hell. We've lost the whole apocalyptic dimension. We've lost confidence in the New Testament Gospels. We have been so obsessed with the human Christ as to lose sight of the divine Christ. There has been the difficulty too on a different level that our generation is very, very conscious of the problem of pain, but not of the problem of sin. Whereas up to the Victorian era, we had exactly the reverse situation, where the problem was a problem of sin, not the problem of pain. Now, I think that the church has soft-pedaled this issue because it doesn't want to be left with the burden of defending a God who inflicts pain, because pain is the ultimate obscenity in our society.
We, and by we I mean Christians, but also more widely, are in quite a state of confusion about eternal punishment, about hell. The imagery is powerful, and the imagery has become somehow more imaginatively vivid in the light of a century which has been hellish in all kinds of ways.
If you want to know what the contemporary geography of hell would look like, then you would think, for example, of the concentration camps. You would think of Nagasaki, Hiroshima. You would think of the attempted genocide of peoples. And you would think, for example, of the landscapes of the trenches in the First World War, where perhaps for the first time human beings began to realize their ability to bring such a devastation to themselves and the landscape, that only a language about hell was appropriate to this landscape.
It is like the eternal place of gnashing of teeth. The slough of despond could be contained in one of its crater holes. The fires of Sodom and Gomorrah could not light a candle to it. It's pockmarked like a body of foulest disease, and its odor is the breath of cancer. In the dank air I have perceived death, and in the darkness felt it. No man's land is like the face of the moon, chaotic, crater-ridden, uninhabitable, awful, the abode of madness. I have just had your long-looked-for letter. It seems wrong that ever your dear handwriting should come into such a Gehenna as this.
It looks as if the end of the great formal religious life in Europe, let's say roughly after Darwin or around Nietzsche's famous God is Dead, has secreted into the bloodstream of modern civilization some of the most powerful venoms ever let loose. Post-religious hatreds and obsessions, kinds of vengeful fundamentalisms without redemption. I see very few other ways of making sense of the fact that the 20th century achieved something previously perhaps inconceivable. The great concentration camps, the death camps, are a very deliberate mimesis, imitation, reconstruction, reduplication of the long history of imaginings about hell. It isn't only, and these are things one can barely speak about rationally, of course, it isn't only the fire pits into which human beings are thrust alive. It is not only the great ovens of Moloch, exactly like in so many of Dante and Hieronymus Bosch's pictures. No, it's something much deeper. It is a deliberate, derisive sense. This is the end of all hope. You will be tortured to death. You will be made ash. You'll be flogged to death, drowned in excrement, all the exact tortures in Dante's Inferno. And there is no redemption, and no one cares. You are cut off, not only from material help, but from that last humanity, which is the cry of the witness, the hope that somewhere out there your voice will penetrate, that your endless sorrow and desolation will find echo. The Nazi guards used to say to many of those who were about to die, you're dying twice or three times over, because even if you were to get news out, no one would ever believe you. And we will then level the camps one day, and no one will believe that anything of this ever happened. You will go into an eternity of oblivion. This, if anything, is a final footnote to any theology of damnation. For when time will end after the last judgment, when the last great stone will seal hell forever, its very existence will no longer be an accessible memory to the blessed. So we have this truly bewildering exactitude of reproduction on the earth, on the surface of the earth, of what had long been the image of the subterranean. Over and over, those who first came upon this unspeakable world spoke of it as absolute hell on earth. There is no other language adequate to it.
The fact that the language gets used does suggest that we can't escape that coming to terms with our final uselessness, our final impotence in the face of certain kinds of suffering. There are some things that will never be all right, and it will never have been all right that they've been. No possible future can do away with this. They're stuck, they're fixed as images of suffering.
Hell still has considerable meaning. It hasn't lost its meaning by any means, but the meaning now for most people surely is much more psychological. We think of hell now in terms of psychological torment. And we look back to various quotes and things of people in the past who have said that hell was in them, that they carried their own hell about with them.
When I was 5 years old, my parents took me to see the doctor. I was made to sit in a kind of dentist's chair. Then, without warning or explanation, my arms and legs were tied with leather straps to the frame of the chair. Half senseless with fear, I craned my neck to look into my parents' faces, and when I saw that they too were frightened, the bottom fell out of the world. The doctor hustled them both out of the room, fastened a metal tray beneath my chin, prized my chattering teeth apart, and forced a rubber gag between my jaws. There followed several indelible minutes of steel instruments being thrust into the back of my mouth, of choking and vomiting blood into the tray beneath my chin. That is how tonsillectomies were performed without anesthesia, AD 1910, in Budapest. Those moments of utter loneliness, abandoned by my parents in the clutches of a hostile and malign power, filled me with a kind of cosmic terror. It was as if I had fallen through a manhole into a dark underground world of archaic brutality. Thenceforth, I never lost my awareness of the existence of that second universe into which one might be transported without warning, from one moment to the other. The world had become ambiguous, invested with a double meaning. Events moved on two different planes at the same time, a visible and an invisible one. Like a ship which carries its passengers on its sunny decks, while its keel plows through the dark, phantom world beneath.
In an earlier age, it was possible to talk about torments and so forth being inflicted from outside, but now, with Sartre's Hell as Other People and images like that, we're very conscious of its being a matter of personal constraint that we're talking about. Hell, the image of ultimate futility or frustration, powerlessness, and pain, has come to be seen in psychological terms, not in terms of being in a place where terrible things happen to you.
In French classical drama, which is my own background, and tuning fork, for instance, in Racine, final pain, final descent into hell is two human beings standing, facing each other very quietly and saying adieu, saying goodbye, knowing they will never see each other again, defining the unbearable pain of everlasting torture by a parting, by an absence. Something again of that quietness, remember it, in Sartre's No Exit.
We're going to sit down calmly. We're going to close our eyes. And each of us will try to forget that the others are here.
But of course, the play not only is punctuated by long silences, but ends by the three characters, each trying not to face each other's eyes, and absolutely no breath of air. And there is a hell whose loudest noise is like a leaf falling into very dark water.
Looking at the whole history of Christian thinking about hell can be an embarrassing business. You see all the moral shabbiness and the moral destructiveness of it. You see the sadism and the glibness and the smugness coming through. And it's very hard then to tease out what there is there that's necessary or positive. I suppose for myself it's something to do with the idea of choice, which is there from the start. In the Gospels, you have this notion that you might make a wrong choice which destroys you.
My view is that if you eliminate or minimize the concept of divine holiness, of divine wrath or anger, and therefore of hell, that you end up rewriting the whole of Christianity, because neither Christ nor the cross makes any sense except within the assumptions which give rise to the doctrine of hell in the Christian faith.
It seems to me almost the strangest thing about the relationship between God and the world, as I understand it through the Christian tradition, that God will not be, cannot be, because he's love, coercive. So no one can be dragged into salvation by the scruff of the neck. And that means that there is, at least formally, the possibility, and I think actually in experience also the possibility, that people can not want that inviting presence of God and can distance themselves from it. And God will not force them out of the distance.
Starless are the nights of travel, bleak the winter wind. Run with terror all before you, and regret behind.
Push on to the world's end, pay the dread guard with a kiss, cross the rotten bridge that totters over the abyss.
There stands the deserted castle, ready to explore. Enter, climb the marble staircase, open the locked door.
Cross the silent, empty ballroom, doubt and danger past. Blow the cobwebs from the mirror, see yourself at last.
Put your hand behind the wainscot. You have done your part. Find the penknife there and plunge it into your false heart.
Here again you have the idea of hell as a kind of shutting off from a relationship, kind of being closed up in oneself. which is perhaps one of the more morally and spiritually serious ways of talking about hell in the tradition, emphasizing not so much punishment, but what, if you like, I might make of myself.
It's the offence of the invitation to love one another and of the promise that that's possible, which actually scandalizes that in us that wants to be apart and separate and self-contained and self-sufficient. And that is hell. That is hell, whatever time it happens in, whatever state it happens in, whatever space it happens in. And I know nothing about all of these things. But the human core of it is, I think, very much what in 20th century secular idiom Sartre meant when he said, hell is other people.
Wait. I've got it. I know why they've put us together.
Be careful what you say.
Oh, it's so simple. There are no physical tortures, right? And yet, we're in hell. And no one else is going to come, no one. And we'll be alone together forever. Isn't that so? But in fact, there's someone missing here, the torturer.
Don't I know it?
Well, they've cut down on the staff. That's all. The customers will have to serve themselves, like in a cafeteria.
What are you getting at?
Each of us is the torturer for the other two.
The whole kind of metaphysic of hell actually collapses once you see how it works, where it may come from psychologically, how it's been used sociologically and politically. You see that it is, in a sense, a projection of our own hatefulness, our own self-hatred and hatred of the stranger, our own cruelty. And to that extent, I think hell has become a human construct that has been rumbled. We actually see now how it functions. In fact, there's a wonderful Edwin Muir poem that makes this very point. It's called The Good Man in Hell. And the thesis of the poem, essentially, I suppose, is that hell only exists because we allow it. We collude with it.
If a good man were ever housed in hell by needful error of the qualities, perhaps to prove the rule or shame the devil, or speak the truth only a stranger sees, would he at last, grown faithful in his station, kindle a little hope in hopeless hell, and so among the damned doubts of damnation, since here someone could live, and could live well, one doubt of evil would bring down such a grace, open such a gate all Eden could enter in, hell be a place like any other place, and love and hate and life and death begin.
Hell stands for that aspect of reality that we can't cope with and can't master, and which is horrifying and frightening to us. And once again, I think of the images of hell that you find, which are not meant just to be pictures of future desolation or threat, but are meant to represent very vividly to us those appallingly destructive things within us which are just there, and which we have to look at, even contemplate, look full in the face before we can grow as human beings at all.